for people to come in.
Would you like me to start sharing my screen now to just get that set up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Okay, so as our audience comes in, just want to again welcome everybody to the second half of day 2 of CrimCon, and to our stream this afternoon on cybercrime. We'll be going in the order of the program and saving all questions for the end. If you have a question for any of our panelists, please feel free to post those in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And we will, like I said, do all questions at the end. We should have plenty of time for that. This stream today is sponsored by Southern Illinois University Press. So please go to the website and check out all of the amazing scholarship available there. Each of our presenters will have 10 minutes to speak. I'll jump in at about 9 minutes if it's not clear to me that you're already starting to wrap stuff up. So nobody came here today to see me or listen to me. So we will turn the floor over to our first presenter. Andrew, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Andy. I just wanted to check because I can't see it on my screen. Is my PowerPoint up there?
Yep. Yeah, you're good to go.
Okay, good. I'll assume it's all working properly. Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Andrew Nevin, and I'm a PhD candidate in sociology from the University of Toronto. This really represents a work in progress regarding the theoretical aspects of my dissertation, so I really welcome any feedback. The fundamental claim that I'm making is that the subfield of cyber-criminology would benefit from new theorizing to explain virtual offending. I first argue that there are challenges associated with only relying on traditional criminological theories and transposing them for the use within internet environments. And the internet environment tends to have unique structural characteristics like greater anonymity, asynchronicity, limited physical cues that impact behaviors differently than in face-to-face social contexts. So I suggest that one possible way to overcome these challenges is to adapt the existing theories to the internet to keep their main mechanisms, but modify other aspects to better fit within digital spaces. I also offer another pathway, which is to develop new theories that explicitly consider the importance of cyberspace's structural characteristics and place them at the forefront of criminological theorizing. I specifically propose 2 new theorizing frameworks. One's called context congruent theorizing, the other context crossing theorizing. And these in different ways incorporate the insights from digital sociology in order to highlight how the internet affords criminal opportunities. If I have enough time, I'll try to conclude by briefly discussing an application of context congruent theorizing in the form of my own theory called cyberpsychopathy. So, cybercrime scholarship has historically been dominated by mobilizing traditional criminological theories to explain online offending. This embodies what's called the continuist perspective in the field, which maintains that the nature of crime is the same across online and offline contexts, and that the impact of contextual differences on delinquency is really overstated. As such, old crimes are either just reenacted online or they're amplified to merely provide more accessible or inexpensive means to engage in existing types of crimes. For example, things like theft, fraud, and harassment just take on new forms or can shift in scope when they're online. So according to Grabowski in 2001, he says that cybercrime really just represents old wine in new bottles, which allows for traditional frameworks to really guide our explanation. On the other side of the debate are the transformationists, who argue that our assumptions regarding virtual criminality must be adjusted to acknowledge that the offline and the online are fundamentally different spaces, and not really just extensions of each other. This introduces some difficulties if we're trying to equate physical and social structures from the face-to-face context to the digital environments, as well as assumptions regarding established mechanisms and how well they translate between these contexts. So from this view, cybercrime is really a novel phenomenon that's distinct in nature and in form. So cyberspace expands the deviant imagination and really leads to new crimes, things like hacking perhaps. And the implication here is that novel forms of offending may require alternative explanations, bringing about new opportunities for theorizing. So if we take the transformationists seriously, our theories should make sure that they emphasize the unique structural conditions of cyberspace that individually and together afford criminal opportunities or weaken behavioral constraints. So I have a list of them here and I'll go through them. Virtuality is really capturing how the internet is disembodied, dematerialized, or even considered anti-spatial, with the capacity for its instant global connectivity. And this can minimize time and space barriers to interpersonal communication, creating new opportunity structures, or perhaps expanding the reach of criminal activities and networks. Next, there's a fragmented and transnational structure to the internet that creates jurisdictional challenges for law enforcement. And there's really no universal laws, and cyber criminals can sort of jump between jurisdictions that have weaker punishments, making cyberspace appear ungovernable. Anonymity is one that we're all familiar with. This really reflects the sense of being hidden from monitoring. And when you have greater perceived invisibility, it tends to allow people to avoid the norm enforcers and functions to neutralize fear of consequences and one's sense of personal accountability for their actions. Asynchronicity refers to a delayed communication channel in which interpersonal interactions may not occur in real time. And this tends to remove immediate feedback following one's actions and can lead to desensitization toward possible consequences. There's also a relative lack of physical or nonverbal cues like eye contact or facial expressions, especially in text-based environments. And in their absence, this means there are fewer empathy cues to prompt placing oneself in another's shoes or emphasizing humanity. Finally, it tends to be difficult to identify social norms that apply universally online, as most are only enforced by certain communities, leading to these fragmented moral codes that make cyberspace appear pretty normless. So the traditional theories come from the continuous, as I mentioned, and they really address cybercrime with traditional frameworks that have been informed by research in embodied spaces. Many of the mechanisms in these theories do work across contexts, like social learning, for example, but not always. So due to the structural differences, there are some challenges with transposing some theories to the internet and assuming that they'll explain virtual deviance as well as offline deviance. I'll use routine activity theory as an example. So the assumption is that with cybercrime, just like street crime, it can be explained by a motivated offender, criminal opportunity, and the absence of a capable guardian. Yar in 2005 argues that our understanding of proximity and distance and temporality in cyberspace don't really match the physical world. There's really no sense of distance online. And with asynchronicity involved as well, it makes it difficult to establish offenders and targets as co-present. And also really what counts as a digital guardian when you're online? Is it a forum moderator? Can it involve things like surveillance or anti-malware software? These are important distinctions that we need to make. Another example might involve the general theory of crime that tends to link low self-control to offending when there are opportunities to do so. The disembodied internet actually creates more opportunities and might remove constraints tied to physical mobility, like fitness. You're not jumping over fences to escape police or anything like that. And this might contribute to less aging out of cybercrime. So while the theoretical mechanism still works, their interpretations might require some more nuance. One way that we can address some of these challenges is perhaps by adapting or modifying existing theories to better account for the structural differences within the internet context. One such example is digital drift theory by Goldsmith and Brewer, who extend Matz's notion that individuals are not completely socialized into delinquent behaviors, but can drift into or out of deviance depending on situational factors. They argue that technology creates new opportunities to engage and disengage from criminal communities in both contexts, because online relationships may not overlap with their offline ones. The internet facilitates two conditions for drift. The first one's affinity, so there's immediate rewards. And then it also offers new means of making deviant associations and developing deviant skills. Another way of adapting theories is more in practice. And this is more recently coming from Bosler, who argues that we should use what are called cyber-integrated theories, which focuses on how the structural characteristics of cyberspace may actually moderate the empirically known correlates of cybercrime. In other words, we can still use the established mechanisms, but we should measure how much anonymity, for example, impacts the relationship between something like low self-control and online offending. He says we shouldn't throw out the baby with the bathwater by turning away from criminological traditions, but we should draw conclusions that are considering the internet structure in some way. Then the other approach that I was teasing was that we can actually develop new theories. So instead of just adapting them, we can develop new ones that are treating the unique structural characteristics as core elements that are driving offending on the internet, which is implying that there are real contextual effects underlying any observed differences in online and offline deviance. One example is space transition theory from Jay Shankar, which argues that cybercrimes have unique causes because the patterns of behaviors fundamentally differ in online environments. And he directly models qualities like anonymity and spatiotemporal differences and conflicting norms between the contexts. I actually propose two broad frameworks that are for theorizing cybercrime that both critically consider the qualities that make cyberspace distinct, and then I place those qualities at the forefront of theorizing. They vary in terms of how they each view the relationship between online and offline contexts. And my hope is that these new frameworks can help guide the development of original and testable specific theories of cybercrime. So my first theorizing framework is called context congruent theorizing. And this captures the notion that our structural considerations need to match or align with our analytic context. So if we are specifically theorizing cybercrime, for example, at the outset, we have to account for how anonymity or asynchronicity influence criminal motivations and opportunities. These conditions and dynamics of cyberspace need to serve as the starting point of the theory, making a priori assumptions about how the context itself may influence misbehaving. In practice, this may play out as having things like anonymity serve as like exogenous variables within our models so that their behavioral impacts are given a primary focus. Space transition theory definitely falls into this umbrella. Another is my own theory of cyber-psychopathy, which again, time permitting, I can discuss in the next slide, otherwise in the Q&A. The other theorizing framework I have is called context crossing theorizing. And this emphasizes how we often engage in online interactions while simultaneously participating with others in physical spaces. So we're usually—
1 minute left, Andrew.
Thanks, Andy. So we're usually 1 foot in, 1 foot out. And many online activities don't involve psychologically anchoring in one of these contexts because they're so fleeting and insignificant, allowing people to cross over between contexts and sort of blur their online and offline experiences. Networks and resources tend to overlap between the contexts and are drawn upon in both, further complicating their analytic separation. So ultimately, this framework tries to overcome a false online-offline dualism and acknowledge that the influences of technology on crime can't really be understood as operating in a separate or less real sphere of our experience. So I think digital drift is something that could be captured here, while other applications of the framework are still in development in my dissertation. And as I mentioned, I do have my own theory of cyber-psychopathy, which I'm very happy to talk about in the Q&A as an application of context congruent theorizing. The general idea is that I propose that the internet facilitates the expression of a darker version of the self that motivates deviant behaviors, so that the characteristics of cyberspace like anonymity may actually prompt the heightened expression of psychopathic personality traits. So things like a lack of empathy and remorse, a weaker moral compass, and greater impulsiveness that might actually serve as a mediator between these structural conditions and online offending. So I'm definitely happy to talk about that later, as well as sort of the practical implications of that work. So just in conclusion, I think that as research into cybercrime continues to expand, there remains many possibilities for adapting existing criminological theories while also opening up room for researchers to introduce new ideas that can operate alongside them. These new ideas can be adopted or removed in light of empirical examination, as well as comparisons of their relative explanatory power. And I think that's the way that we try to move cybercriminology forward as a field. And I do think that approaching theorizing with an explicit focus on the structural differences between online and offline contexts encourages our critical reflection on how misbehaviors and just general social behaviors can be differently enacted or motivated in digital spaces. So as our society continues to spend more time immersed online, I think we need to take more insights from digital sociology and realize how important they will be for encouraging new theoretical discussions and informing cybersecurity policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Our next presentation, Piracy and Alternate Trade Routes in the Golden Age of Digital Media. Oliver, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Wonderful. I will try and make this work somehow. Okay, share my screen. There we go. It's fine. I genuinely do know what I'm doing. It's just
I tell myself that all the time too.
it's not like this is what I study. This is what I do. But it's fine. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Okay, we'll see.
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So assuming everyone can see this, my name is Arthur Bowers. I'm a doctoral candidate at Washington State University. I'm a criminologist, and this is actually my dissertation, and it's almost finished now. So this is kind of a, my conference presentation about my dissertation. As Andy mentioned, it's about piracy and alternate trade routes in the golden age of digital media. So let's get started, given our time frame. Okay, so as of right now, there is a huge prevalence and saturation of digital media. Everything is digitized. There are tons of streaming services. Everything we do exists in a digital world, effectively. And something we've kind of already heard about a little bit today, but the way that we view criminology and criminal justice has changed. It needs to evolve because these concepts are different now. They exist in a digital world, effectively. So the way that the digital media industry and the criminal justice system perceive a crime like piracy or cybercrime is a matter of contention right now. There's a lot of research into industry losses as a result of digital media piracy, which is one of those things that, once again, is kind of debated. But there's also this idea of the neutralization of the criminality itself, meaning that it's typically not perceived as actually even being a crime. It's victimless. But one of the most pertinent factors to consider now is this idea that the access to illicit content is incredibly simple. You can literally Google a film, a TV show, something, and you will find 100 links for it immediately. This is not something that used to be, it used to be just within the hacker sphere, it used to be something really hard to do, but now it is just everywhere. So because of this, the scope of piracy is expanding exponentially. Under COVID, especially, rates of interest in piracy, which is, previous research that I've done, really shows that everything has been ramping up, like huge rates of piracy, which means we need new research, we need new approaches. Most research in piracy historically has been done in a quantitative method. My research especially is usually quantitative. And it's very often using convenience samples, usually college students. It's a very particular area that's usually explored. So there's this clear disconnect that exists right now between consumers of digital media, which is all of us really, and the people that produce the content in terms of what people want and what the industry is giving them. And the criminal justice system sits in the middle and kind of tries to work both sides. So therefore, policy approaches can be shaped by research. We know this is a big part of academia. But in order to do that, we need a better understanding of what we're actually dealing with, because this is something that, while it's been explored quite a lot, it's not been explored, too recently in the usual depth. Things are a little different. So, existing research has shown that the stricter the industry gets with copyright controls and the more aggressively they try and do this, piracy ideation actually increases. There is a relationship between the accessibility and affordability of digital media and this inclination to engage in piracy. The impact on the legitimate market is a little bit complex because there is research that shows that piracy can actually increase interest in legal content. The theoretical components, there's a lot in terms of subcultures, attitudes, differential associations, the underlying morality and ethical components of engaging in this particular cybercrime. Displacement of blame is a very common thread that comes up. Equity theory is also something that was new to me when I started my research, but it's now become a very prevalent factor. But this idea of an equal and balanced marketplace can make people disinclined to engage in piracy. The Robin Hood mindset comes up a lot, people think there's this libertarian ideal within piracy that it's, you know, free content, free for everyone. It's artistic expression. You can pull this stuff out and give it to everyone. But as I mentioned earlier, there's a very easy way to do it now. Things are so incredibly simple. So my research, what I found that was missing, the home theater personal computer area has been effectively untapped. There's almost no research on it at all. We're also missing a qualitative exploration of the narratives that lead people to piracy or not to, but understanding how people come to platforms, how do these platforms facilitate piracy, how do the communities themselves feel about the concept of piracy, and what critical moments and critical events lead users to actually engage in piracy. So I wanted to find out, do these communities facilitate piracy? Do they make it easier? Do they actively encourage piracy? What critical moments lead users to these communities to begin with, and, you know, to actually use them? And what role do these communities play in the digital media marketplace? So I picked the 4 primary platforms: Plex, MB, Kodi, and Jellyfin. A lot of data mining, a lot of data pulling on this one just to figure out the best platforms to go. I chose these 4. There was a lot of crossover between participants, you know, across the different platforms. I got 25 users in the end, and I conducted fully anonymous audio-only interviews for confidentiality. They are a notoriously mindful group of tech-savvy people who don't really want to be recorded or, you know, have their faces seen. So everything was confidential to try and increase participation. I was really looking at the narratives of all these users, the critical moments that seemed to be shared across their narratives. And, you know, things we talked about included their communities, the piracy itself, these hypothetical events that were, you know, profit to them to see how they would respond. And then I had a bunch of probing questions about how they have evolved as users, how they built their libraries, the fluidity between platforms, which was huge, how they deal with content-related roadblocks, and industry norms, and how their communities fit into the wider industry. I used in vivo for a lot of my coding and thematic network analysis to map out the ecosystem and a lot of the important themes. But I also use narrative analysis to transform the transcripts into storylines for, you know, different user types, and to show the different critical moments that they kind of often hit. To really show these shared narratives, these shared stories between different types of users, those that do engage in piracy, those that categorically don't, those that used to, you know, really trying to get into their personal storylines. So in terms of results, the most that I can do with the time frame we have today is really break down some of the key points for you. But accessibility of content was a huge, huge impact on those who, you know, decided to engage in piracy. Wanting access to the content that they wanted in a means which was accessible to them was a huge influencing factor. More prevalent in terms of the HTPC was how they use the content and how it fits into their life. So being able to watch content on as many different screens as they wanted in as many different formats, and having the control of a content that they had purchased was a huge factor. There was a lot of discussion of the limitations of the legitimate platforms, you know, like Netflix, Hulu, and the digital platforms like Movies Anywhere and, you know, what was like Ultraviolet, and how you don't actually own a lot of content. You have a license to view it while it's on the platform, but as we saw with things like Ultraviolet, when that platform goes, you lose all your content. Critically, almost all users had engaged in piracy before they entered the HTPC community. So the communities themselves do not directly facilitate piracy. People went to them either engaging in piracy or not. And as users, that didn't really change. The communities themselves, they effectively helped users to streamline their libraries, access it better, and do more with their media. But piracy really isn't the focus of it, which I think is really important in terms of ideation, because for a lot of existing research, piracy communities were looked at where everyone already engaged. But within the HCPC world, you can engage or you don't have to. There's no, categorical, if you are here, you're engaged in piracy. But it was interesting to see that for people who didn't want to engage in piracy, they were able not to. And some people are staunchly opposed to it. But for those who did engage in piracy, they had been doing it for many, many years beforehand. And the HCPC setup really just helped them streamline what they were doing. They effectively became better at it, but they didn't learn anything new.
About 1 minute left, Oliver.
Thank you. So obviously, I do have a few limitations as of right now. Selection bias. I chose the 4 primary platforms. This is based on all the research I'd done. There are a couple of other platforms, but in terms of users, I don't think I lost too many, but this is something I have to consider. This was reliant on the willingness of participants and self-reporting criminality, but with all of the protections, data protections and anonymity controls I had, this didn't seem to be a problem because a lot of them admitted serious criminality. And obviously this is qualitative research, but it's not generalizable beyond the actual communities, but it is representative of the different user types. But the single biggest limitation I had was I had to use Zoom as a requirement of the research per IRB. And within the tech community, Zoom is not a good name. And a lot of people, I had to kind of fight and encourage a lot to try and get people to engage because I was using Zoom, which a lot of people were not happy with, but yeah. And that's it. I'm done. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you so much. Our final presentation, Stephen Kemp, fraud reporting in the internet era. Stephen, the floor is yours whenever you're ready.
Okay. So in theory, you should be able to see and hear me and see my PowerPoint. Is that correct?
Yes. Yep.
Yes.
You're good.
Perfect. Okay. So good afternoon, good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. My name is Stephen Kemp. I'm from the University of Girona in Spain. Here it is dinner time, so if you hear any screaming in the background, I apologize in advance. It's children's dinner time. I'm here to tell you about some research I've been doing on fraud reporting in the internet era. And to begin the presentation, I just wanted to kind of introduce the idea and introduce some of the justifications behind the research. So first of all, why is crime reporting important? Well, crime reporting is important because it enables policymakers and practitioners to have a clearer image of the threat that's facing citizens, that's facing society, okay? It enables them to make better or more efficient decisions about where to allocate resources, for example, or also for the design and evaluation of prevention and reaction strategies. Then, so why is fraud reporting research relevant? Well, there are 3 main reasons. First of all, fraud, there's a lot of evidence that fraud is one of the most, if not the most prevalent offenses in the internet era. Similarly, there's, on the second hand, there's quite a lot of evidence that fraud is significantly underreported in comparison to other traditional property crimes. And then also fraud has financial impacts, but it also has a lot of non-financial impacts as well, emotional and psychological impacts on victims that can be very related, obviously, to the reporting process. So what I do in this study is I do examine online and offline fraud, basically because some of the findings about traditional crime reporting or traditional fraud reporting could be relevant, could be applicable to the online environment and to design of better reporting channels for fraud in the internet era. So what do we know about crime reporting in general? Well, we know that sometimes there are some demographic correlates of reporting. For example, older people tend to report more than younger people. We know that the economic factors are important in the sense of the economic impact of crime, but also in the sense, that the victims of crime quite often carry out some form of cost or benefit calculation of the benefits of actually reporting and the costs of doing so. Okay? Some of those costs can be related to the psychological factors, like, for example, the embarrassment or the stigma associated with reporting. And then there are also institutional and context factors, like, for example, the opinion regarding the police or the criminal justice system, or even the safety in the local area. What do we know about cybercrime reporting? So far, there's not a lot of research. Most of it is qualitative, but we do know that there are some differences between traditional and cybercrime reporting. There is some research that's found some differences between the correlates. Regarding fraud specifically, what do we know already about fraud underreporting? We know that fraud reporting is lower than other property crimes. There's quite a lot of evidence that it's reported at a lower rate than other traditional property crimes. And qualitative research has identified a number of reasons for that. For example, people that may be unaware of where to report, or they're unaware of they've actually been a victim. Also related to the utility of reporting, or maybe a lack of confidence in the police's ability to help, which is kind of related to what some of the other panelists have spoken about before about anonymity. So the study that I wanted to talk about today aims to answer two main questions. Okay, so first of all, what are the socio-demographic and crime event determinants of fraud reporting, and how do these differ between online and offline fraud? And then secondly, what socio-demographic and crime event factors are associated with specific reasons for not reporting fraud, and are these similar for online and offline? So to answer these questions, I used a sample from the two most recent editions of the Catalan Public Security Survey. That survey is representative for the region of Catalonia in Spain. It's a region of about 7 million people. It's representative in terms of gender, age, and then also the municipality. And then that gave me a final sample of 1,177 fraud victims. Okay. So then from this survey, I also extracted a number of variables. The main variable is whether the fraud victim reported or not. Then also there are a number of demographic variables. Some variables related to the person's opinion regarding the police, the criminal justice system, or safety in their local area. Variables related to the crime event, importantly, the modus operandi. That is whether the fraud was committed via the internet, via the telephone, or in person. Also the impact of the fraud in terms of economic impact and psychological impact, and the annoyance that it caused. And then also there were some variables that were the reasons for not reporting. So the reasons why people decided not to report. And I carried out a number of binary regression models, mainly with reporting as a binary dependent variable, but also sometimes using the reasons as well as a dependent variable. So I'm going to have a look at some of those results now. So first of all, in terms of descriptive results, regarding reporting rates, reporting is really low. Okay, even when the fraud was considered a crime, as you can see here, it was only reported at about 21% in 21% of the cases. Okay, there were some discrepancies between the different modus operandi. Surprisingly, internet fraud was reported more than fraud which was committed via the telephone or in person. And then some descriptors regarding the reasons. In the survey, they asked about 6 reasons. The most commonly chosen reason was that the reporting process was basically too complex. Okay. The second most common reason was that the losses were insignificant. And the third most common reason was that the respondent believed there was little the police could do. So let's have a look at some of the results from the regression models, from the statistical models. So first of all, I carried out or applied a regression model with the full sample. Okay, and in that model, we find that the modus operandi is important, in the sense that people who have been a victim of fraud via the telephone or or in person are less likely to report than the internet. Unsurprisingly, when the fraud was considered a crime, people were more likely to report. And then also the financial impact and the annoyance positively affected reporting. So based on this, what I wanted to do is to create a couple of subsets, okay, a couple of subsamples. So first of all, I subset the individuals who considered their fraud a crime to look at what led to them to report. And again, modus operandi was important. If they had been a victim of a fraud that occurred via the internet, they were more likely to report, and financial impact as well. And then also applied another two models, this time subsetting the main sample into online and offline fraud for that comparison. And again, the results were pretty similar. When the fraud was considered a crime, it was more likely to be reported. And then those impact factors of financial impact and annoyance were also statistically significant in a positive manner. And then offline, again, crime was important. And this time, financial impact and psychological impact were statistically significant in a positive manner. So following on from this, I also wanted to have a look at the reasons for non-reporting. So I carried out some analysis on the factors associated with the reasons why people don't report fraud. And there were a number of correlates. For example, females were less likely to consider the process too complex or lack confidence in the police. And then on the other hand, foreign-born respondents were more likely to consider the reporting process too complex, and they were more likely to fear making things worse by reporting, which I think is quite an interesting finding that definitely requires further exploration. And then also I carried out some analysis looking at the relationship between the different reasons for not reporting. And again, there are many associations, but most relevantly, I think, is that those respondents who considered the process too complex also were likely to consider their amount that they'd lost insignificant and to lack confidence in the police and in the criminal justice system. And then, unsurprisingly, there was a group of respondents who said that they didn't report because there was little that the police can do. They lacked confidence in the police, or they lacked confidence in the criminal justice system.
About 1 minute left.
Okay, perfect. So just to wrap up, the main conclusions, the main takeaways from the results is that there was higher reporting of internet fraud, basically because it seems that it was more likely to be considered a crime than the other modus operandi. In general, for fraud reporting, there was no clear demographic profile in the analysis that I conducted, but there were some demographic associations for the internet fraud reporters, and also with regards to the reasons for not reporting. Regarding the impacts, the financial loss, annoyance, psychological impact, they were significant in a number of the models, but the effect sizes were quite small. But I think the fact that they were relevant in a number of the models shows that there probably is a degree of rationality in fraud reporting. Also because the complexity of the process, as possibly a cost of reporting, and the insignificance of the losses could indicate that there's a kind of a rational calculation going on there with regards to reporting. And also the role of the opinion regarding the police and the justice system appears to be relevant as well. So many thanks for listening. Obviously, I don't have time to get into kind of more of the practical implications or the policy implications. If anybody's interested, the study is already published in the European Journal of Criminology, and I'd be happy to answer any questions now or via email, as you can see. Thank you.
Thank you. So there we go. So we have some time for questions now. If you have any questions for any of our panelists, please go ahead and enter those and post those in the Q&A box. While we wait to see if anybody does have anything that they want to ask, I did have a question for you, Andrew, and this might apply also, Oliver, to you. So Andrew, you got my attention when you said that, like with cybercrime, there might not be the same aging out effect. And I just got to thinking about like how our perspective on technology might change as we age. And I remember reading somewhere, this wasn't like anything sociological, I don't think, but an author saying that like the technology that we have when we're kids just seems normal to us. Technology that comes out or sort of evolves in our teens and 20s and 30s seems like really cool and innovative. And then after like 40 and beyond, technology starts to take on this kind of scary, it wasn't like this in my day kind of feel. And I'm just curious if you think that might play a part in sort of people's willingness to engage in cybercrime, or that might be a factor in the aging out process. Or
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question. I've been thinking a lot about this too, because I've noticed that a lot of times when we're looking at certain types of cyber crimes, like cyberbullying, for example, it's almost always looked at from the perspective of like a youthful form of deviance. It's always associated with like young people doing it. And I think we have a tendency when we look at cyber crimes in general to sort of assume that everything is happening for the younger groups. And I've actually done a little bit of work, and part of my future research agenda is to be looking at how things like cyberbullying, which is something that has been framed as youthful deviance, is something that's actually quite common within older, like emerging adults and older adults as well. So I think that to a certain degree, we might feel like technology, we have perception about technology being new, and like maybe as people get older they might not want to do stuff as much, but I think we still see quite a bit of participation in different types of cyber crimes when people are older, and maybe not even specifically crimes but deviants, things like trolling and flaming, like you see on Reddit and even on non-anonymous social media like Facebook, people being complete jerks to each other regardless of sort of how old they are. I think where the age thing, the part of the age thing that I'm really interested in as well is this idea of like, I think as you grow up with technology, and when you grow up with technology during your psychosocial development, I think you learn a little bit more about what norms are out there for online, as to like what's a behavior, what's an acceptable kind of thing I can do online. Whereas someone who's coming to technology later in life might have a completely different skew, like they might have a skewed belief about what is okay and so on. And I'm not saying there's universal norms, but I think that level of like socialization into some sort of online norms is a bigger age effect than maybe some of the other ways we can look at age.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about. Like, I almost want to. I mean, it wouldn't be like a nonlinear relationship, but I don't know. That's how my mind is trying to conceive of it. But anyway, thank you. And so to follow up, Andrew, you got your wish. We have a question asking for you to explain a little bit more of your theory of cyber psychopathy and what type of data is available to support it.
Sure. Okay, so I mentioned it briefly. Basically, my cyber psychopathy theory is drawing upon a combination of symbolic interaction as sociological theory, social psychological ideas of like a context-dependent sense of personality. And basically, as I said, I'm sort of hypothesizing that the different structures of the internet are prompting the heightened expression of psychopathic traits. So things that make you feel like a little bit less empathetic, less remorse, more impulsiveness. And I basically view that shift towards more psychopathy as something called cyber psychopathy. And I view that shift as being attributed to the fact that cyberspace tends to be less, it tends to feel less real, as if we're not interacting with real people, which sort of functions to increase those sort of like psychological distancing between internet users and foster essentially dehumanization effects that mirror those expressions of psychopathic traits in an interpersonal kind of context. And this might also make deviant behaviors that are in virtual environments seem less harmful or more acceptable than similar offline transgressions. And I guess the other part of this is I also argue that because I'm using this idea of like the self and symbolic interactionist ideas like a deviant self, I argue that sort of this dissociation of self that might happen online may neutralize one's sense of accountability, minimize a sort of cognitive dissonance that they might have about what they're engaging in online, to say that, you know, my online misbehaviors are not really me at all. It's a different version of myself, whether it's, that would be maybe a more of a conscious application of this, but there might also be just an unconscious application of these types of traits as well. And in terms of evidence, so I've been working on this for a few years. I've been mostly working with pilot data, quantitative data from surveys. So my initial pilot data had 400, maybe like 410 participants in it. And I had to develop some new scales in order to measure it. So I took an established psychopathy scale called the Levinson self-report psychopathy scale. And I created, I took those items and I modified them so that there was an online version and an offline version that were very distinct from each other, but they had the same items, but they were like contextually constrained. So I was able to compare scores between the two contexts in order to see if there was a gap between like an online version of psychopathy and an offline one. And I used that in order to, or I guess I found evidence initially that on average, people do express higher levels of psychopathy when they're online than when they're offline. And the predictors of those underlying increases are things like being male, younger, spending more time online, having higher levels of digital literacy. And that's only like part of the story, because the other half of that is like, so now does cyber psychopathy actually predict, you know, deviance to some degree as well, which is the other part of the theory. And the preliminary data suggests that higher levels of cyber psychopathy predict both increases in the perceived acceptability of certain online misbehaviors like trolling and flaming and piracy, as well as the sort of hypothetical likelihood that someone would engage in them. I didn't measure anything directly. It was all with like vignettes, you know, so-and-so engaged in this behavior, how likely would you be to do that? So they weren't like direct outcomes, but piracy was also predicting that. And the next step now is to actually run a formal mediation analysis. So I can get the perceived sense of social structure from people, you know, looking at your most used social media platform or your most used online platform, like say Reddit or something. How anonymous do you feel? Do you engage in these like real-time interactions or not? I can sort of code anonymity, asynchronicity, and I can use those as variables within a structural equation model in order to figure out whether that's leading to some sort of mediation with a cyber psychopathy effect, or whether it's just really a direct relationship to online offending, which seems to always be there in the literature, the assumption that anonymity just leads to offending. Whereas I want to say that there's this middle part to it. So, I mean, I could go on forever about this, but I know there's more questions. So I'll leave it at that, but hopefully that filled in some of the blanks.
Thank you. Okay, a question just came in for Stephen. How can cyber fraud reporting be increased? Are there any recommendations you would provide?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. So I think from the things I've been looking at, one of the most important factors is really reducing the complexity of the process. I imagine that most of the people here aren't familiar with crime reporting in Spain, but it's not an easy process. For example, in fraud reporting, the victim often has to go to their bank, then to the police, and then back to their bank again to try and recover the funds, and it can take like a whole morning, for example. So I think one element is certainly to make the process less complex, okay, potentially more centralized in the case of Catalonia, for example. Then also I would suggest improving the way that victims are dealt with at the police station, for example. There's lots of qualitative evidence that I have that they're not particularly well received. I know many cases of people who've literally been laughed at. So to improve reporting, it needs to be seen to be a benefit, so that people that go actually get support, especially in cases of like romance fraud where there's been significant psychological impacts. So those would kind of be the main things, but also showing people who report that their report has actually served some kind of purpose, that it's helped inform future policies. So giving people feedback, maybe that's something that's done in some areas, that they get some kind of feedback about how the process is going. And something that's come up in research is that when there's not any feedback about how the process has gone, and that serves to make people lower their opinion of crime reporting in general. So those are some of the ideas. That there are a few more as well, but in case there are any more questions, I'll stop there.
We actually do have to stop here, just in the interest of time. So I want to say thank you again to all of our presenters today on your really fascinating and incredible work. Thank you to everybody in attendance. I want to remind everyone and say that this stream is sponsored by Southern Illinois University Press. Head over to their website to check out everything they've got available. Hey, if you are sticking around for the protest scholarship stream happening in 10 minutes, I have to reboot the webinar just for recording purposes. So it'll be live again in about 10 minutes or so. Take care, everybody. I hope CrimCon has been worthwhile for you all. And thank you again to all of our presenters today. See you around.